It's taking some time.
I think we are already online. I see it on YouTube, so I'll just start.
Great. Let me just check quickly because it's not showing on Restream. Yeah, we are.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Alexi. Okay, I'll start then. Hello, everyone. I'm Utkarsha, and today I'll moderate the session on behalf of product people. So I'll just start by sharing the agenda. I'll briefly introduce product people to you all, and we'll have the presentation next, followed by a Q&A session and a networking session at the end. So about product people, we are a product management consultancy, and we help companies efficiently discover and deliver great products faster. So we do the unglamorous work of product manager and product owner on interim basis, and most of our contracts are for almost from 2 to 12 months. We can also make pretty decks, but we rather prefer to deliver outcomes. And we are a fully distributed team with the legal entity in Berlin. And apart from this, we are also a product community builder, and we invite product leaders to share their knowledge and experience around product management. So these are some of our clients, as you may know: Scout24, Zalando, Tier, Freeletics. These are some of the clients that we have worked in past or are currently working with. There's news from our side. So if you are looking for a new opportunity, we have product manager opening right now. So you are welcome to apply for this role. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our newest patron, Eric Aaron Lewis. And yeah, so you are welcome to support us on Patreon so that we can run these events smoother. So today I welcome Benjamin Kaser, VP of Product at Contentful, and he'll be sharing with us knowledge about building decision-making habit with Contentful. And thank you, Benjamin, for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation. I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to product people for doing this session. So yeah, let me just share my screen and we'll jump right into it. And hopefully you're able to see my screen now.
Yes, yeah.
Great. Okay, so I was asked to, a little while ago, actually for a different session, I was asked to talk about the difference between startups and scale-ups and some of the things that happen as you go from the startup phase to the scale-up phase. And I developed this presentation about decision-making that I'm going to share with you today. But one of the things that has really occurred to me since then is it's really not about startups or scale-ups per se, that some of the things that I pointed to, I think could apply to teams in almost any organization. It depends on really more the maturity of the team. And so hopefully, even if you don't work at a startup or a scale-up right now, that some of these ideas might be relevant to you and might resonate with you. So in terms of startups, they swim fast to stay afloat. They've got a certain amount of time and money to really build their business and get their idea into the market. And so they don't have a lot of time necessarily to think through every single thing they're doing, let alone think through the decisions. They're building their product offering, they're trying to get customers, they're trying to retain customers that they have, they're trying to raise money oftentimes, and that can mean changing their story multiple times as they pivot and hone their product and really figure out product market fit. They're also trying to hire people oftentimes, and that in and of itself involves a ton of decision making. And it's very important at that early stage when you're hiring a team to hire really good people, obviously. And then they're also trying to build a culture, but culture tends to be something that happens. It's not something necessarily that everybody is great at thinking through. And it emerges as the way you do things. It just is how things are done, but not everybody is necessarily like agreed on that. It just kind of emerges sometimes. But startups are prone to failure. There was a study that I found from 2019, German startup failures. And basically they found that there were two major buckets of problems, one around execution, like how well they did their finance, raised their money, did their marketing, built the technology on the one hand, and on the other hand, process. And involved in process is really how teams work together and then finding that product market fit. And really that accounts for over half of startup failures. And so it just pointed to an area of inquiry for me. Why do so many startups really struggle with the team dynamics? What is it in the team dynamic that doesn't work? And why is product market fit hard to get to? Well, in my mind, both of those things really come from behaviors, that culture that I talked about. But one of the core ones, one of the key ones is how do you make decisions? And so this is what I really focused on. I think there are probably multiple planks of that plan that you have for how you build a great team, but decision-making is definitely one of them. As product people, we're asked to make decisions all day long, all the time. It's what we get paid for. We often talk about decision fatigue because it's exhausting. I don't know if any of you can relate to that, but all day people are asking you, what do you think about this? What should I do about that? And in that kind of flow of everything, decisions get made, but they are hard to make. And some of the reasons they're hard to make is because big decisions and small decisions, when they come at you all day long, can start to blur. So you're actually maybe not focusing enough on the big ones, and you're focusing too much maybe on the little ones. And it's sometimes hard to differentiate when you just have constant decisions coming at you. When you're learning about how to build a product and you're talking with a team, oftentimes the last big customer that you worked with can actually sort of overshadow the discussion and sort of push the decisions in a certain direction. The same can be true of anecdotes that people pick up along the way about building product. People think about, when I talked to this customer, they said this, and they may have a couple of examples of anecdotes, and sometimes those in a vacuum of other kinds of data and in a team dynamic where you're trying to make a decision, that can sort of influence the decision in an outsized way. Something else that I've also seen happen, and it doesn't need to be a founder, it could also just be a team leader or somebody even with just a really big personality. Those people can sometimes be the ones that end up making a lot of the decisions because the team sort of subcontracts their decision-making onto that one person. If they can't figure out what to do, they kind of look to that one person, whether it's a founder or a lead or somebody else. And then the other thing that kind of happens in teams that I've noticed quite a bit around decision-making and teamwork is stress. And as the stress kind of rises, when people don't know what to do, they sometimes just make a decision to get it out of the way. But the thing about product decisions is that they're not like other kinds of decisions. And they're really important to treat a little bit differently. And it's not the same thing as what we'll wear in the morning to work or some other kinds of life decisions. Even product decisions are really a question of resources and time and putting things in order in a way that the rest of life isn't really like that. So it's an agreement to do a thing, a product decision, but generally that means that you're going to do it first, and it means that you're going to not do other things. So it's an investment in one thing, but then that also implies a divestment from something else, or not investing in that other thing until later on. Most decisions that you make in a product end up having knock-on effects. They end up compounding over time, and it ends up adding up one on the other. And the other really hard thing about product decisions is that they're not always 100% obvious. If they were really obvious, we wouldn't really have a struggle making decisions. We would just go ahead and do the obvious thing. And some of the lack of obviousness comes out of the fact that the world doesn't have the data that we need all the time. Sometimes we just can't get the data that we need. Sometimes we don't have the right sets of tools to make those decisions. So product decisions are harder than your average decision, in addition to being complicated because of team dynamics. So what happens when you aren't good at making decisions, when you just kind of let them happen, as I talked about earlier? One of the big problems that can arise is that you just don't build the right things. You start to make decisions that seem right at the time, but maybe you haven't thought it through, or you didn't have the data that you need. And eventually over time, the value that you're creating for customers tends to slow down, or you don't really hit that mark the way you thought you were going to. If you're also not really focused on decision-making and how that works, accountability for those decisions and the actions and the outcomes related to the decision end up becoming unclear. And then over time, as accountability kind of goes away, the team sort of loses its focus and mission and effectiveness. Trust can also erode in those situations, and politics come out because people are, maybe worried about having done something wrong or blaming other people, and that can create a really negative environment for teams. And then in those situations, you see sometimes the discussions can get really negative. People end up arguing with each other rather than discussing, and then they might do something like look to a leader to resolve the problem, or they might just make that trigger, that fast trigger decision that isn't necessarily based in all the right thinking, but just to stop the team from arguing. So these are some negative effects that can happen when you don't focus on decisions. So I guess what I would argue is have a look at your teams, think about your own experience, and see if any of this resonates to you. And if it does resonate for you, then maybe one of the things you could think about is how are you making decisions, and work on that as a way of clarifying things and getting better. So as part of this, I want to outline some decision-making styles that I've seen, and you might be able to sort of notice one or two of these as things that you may have done in the past yourself, or you've noticed in teams, or you see happening in teams around you. So this is the game of name your rabbit hole. The first one is leave it to the leader. This is the one that I described before, where the team doesn't make the decision. You just kind of look to the leader and you say, oh, we'll let that guy decide, because if he decides, then we won't be responsible and nothing can go wrong. And there's a kind of, sometimes there's fear involved in that type of a style of decision making. The next one is agree to agree. You see this oftentimes in teams where people are very polite, and the Scandinavian cultures actually tend to do a lot of this, and also Spanish. When I lived in Spain, the Spanish decision-making style was very much agree to agree. Everybody would agree with everybody, and they would kind of like talk around and around and around, but nobody was really agreeing and underneath the surface, and so nobody was really committing to anything, and there was no accountability to that decision, so it kind of circulated around and around. I think you probably had this discussion, with your family about what to order for dinner or what to watch on Netflix. It's that kind of like, nobody really wants to make the decision, and it goes around and around. The next one is agree to disagree, but without the commitment. So there's sometimes teams agree to disagree, but then they commit to the thing. You can also see cases where that commitment is lacking, and it's exactly the same as agreeing to agree, except just maybe a little less polite. The other one is the kind of the thing I described earlier about the short attention span thing, where you just have to make a decision quickly because you can't take the indecision and the stress anymore. And that can lead to bad outcomes, but sometimes it alleviates the moment. And sometimes that happens in teams. And then the last one is probably the most difficult one in some ways, is that we're agile, so we don't really make decisions. We just kind of like use the process to make the decisions for us. The problem with that is that agile doesn't work for an infinite number of choices. You make a lot of choices to put into that system, and then what you get out of that is a refinement of those choices. It doesn't really open out again, it only converges down. So what you put at the top of that funnel is going to come out the other end in some form or another. So agile doesn't really work for this. I just wanted to give you a quick anecdote where I've seen some of this decision-making dysfunction in action, and maybe some of you will relate to this. I was with a startup as a kind of an advisor, informal mentor and advisor, and their proposition was B2B, so they were selling to business, and it was all around voice recognition. And the founders had gotten money from that. They had some early success in English language, building a product around it, and they had sort of like a kind of a prototype that worked in a very specific set of circumstances. And then when they went to kind of take it to business, the environment wasn't the same as that prototype, obviously, because the real world never is. But the voice topic was so off limits to the team because it was something that the founders were really committed to. So the discussion couldn't even really address decisions that might lead away from voice proposition. Everything had to lead back to that one place. And so the decision-making was incredibly dysfunctional, because when you would rise something to the top and it didn't match this idea of, we want this voice proposition to work, those discussions really couldn't happen, and no decisions could get made that really countered that proposition. And then fortunately, very fortunately for this company, one of the founders went and did an interview with a customer, and he was actually really good about that. He talked to lots of customers, and he was interviewing this one person who did not speak English, and she had a strong accent. And she, in the course of the interview, she started crying. And he's like, "Why are you crying? You know, we're just trying to find out about the software and how you used it." And she was like, "Well, I'm very sorry, but I'm afraid that I'm going to get fired if I can't get this software to work. So that's why I'm crying." And he realized in that moment, like, okay, this isn't working the way we planned. We need to rethink. And so that was the pivot point where it became okay to have conversations not about voice, and they started making decisions that really worked for the majority of their customers. They did a successful pivot and actually eventually sold the company and had a successful exit. So just an example of how kind of a team that gets into a certain groove or a mindset can really, really prevent the right decisions being made. And I think one thing that could have helped out earlier is if they'd had a more focused decision-making style, that they might not have ever gotten down that far in the rabbit hole. So maybe if you realize, like, okay, maybe we're not the best at making decisions, how could we get better? So here's some ways to start to think about what to focus on. First of all, you just have to kind of abstract the decision-making practice away from all of the noise of the day-to-day, and talk to your colleagues and to your leaders there about the decision-making discipline itself as a separate thing. Like, let's get good at making decisions. Let's not just let the decisions go by, no matter what they are. Let's think about how we're making them and make sure that we're really all together on what we're going to do and why, and we're able to sort of talk that through and then come to a committed conclusion and then execute on it. So one way to do that is to start writing decisions down. And then you loop back on those later on and you point out the decisions that were made and agreed to. And if the thing is drifted off of there, it helps to bring the team back around to, okay, how committed are we to this decision-making process that we've created? And if we start to make decisions and then not follow them, how can we get better at coming back and actually following those decisions through to the end? And then the third thing here is recognize that getting a good decision-making practice in place is a journey. It's not a quick fix. It's more of an indicator of the team dynamics than something that can actually fix the dynamics. But if you adopt a disciplined process around decision-making, it can help guide those other discussions and really open it up to a discussion about what is right and wrong in our culture. So one of the key things that I think you need in order to have a good decision-making culture is to really bring the emotional affect level down. Discussions about what to do ought to be fairly cold. They should be fairly objective. Being passionate about the topic is something that people often talk about, but passion about a topic just means that you're kind of a master of that topic and you're really into it. It doesn't necessarily mean you're trying to shout people down that disagree with you, or that you're getting unhappy, or that you're angry, right? So really focus on bringing that affect level way down. This should be a rational conversation about what to do and what decision to make. It shouldn't be about an emotional exchange. And I think sometimes teams trap themselves in that. Note the time that it takes to make a decision. Sometimes if you're in that agree to agree situation, you'll notice that decisions just loop and loop and loop and loop and loop. That's something that you can note and bring to the front. Also note the decision recycling that might be going on. If you notice that decisions keep coming back and you thought you've made a decision, I'm really sorry, my doorbell just rang. I'll be right back, I apologize. This is like horrible coronavirus timing. I really apologize for that. So notice if there's decision recycling going on in your team. That's also an indication that maybe your decision-making practice and style isn't the best. And also note the effect on results. Really talk about the results of decisions and tie them back to the decisions that you made. So if you agree to a decision in a team and then the result isn't what you thought it was, come back and discuss that, because that's the only way you get better. It's not to assign blame. It's not to sort of find out who is right and who's wrong, or who's smart and who's not. It's really just to get good at talking it through and coming back around to a conclusion. Again, start a conversation with leaders about the decision-making style and try to focus on that as a discipline. And then finally, avoid talking about individuals. And I apologize again, I'm sorry, one moment. Really sorry, guys. It's just like the way it is in Corona times. In the discussion about decision-making and getting good at it, really avoid discussions about individuals and instead focus on roles. So don't talk about how this person always does this or always does that. Really focus on what is the role that person plays. So for example, if somebody is a technology leader, focus on the information that they can bring to the conversation, not on the fact that they may not be the funniest person in the world or somebody who's really pleasant to speak with all the time, but really focus on what they know and what they can contribute to that decision-making process. So here's some hygiene for better decision-making. Use data and not judgment. So it's better to acknowledge that you don't have the data actually available rather than jump to a conclusion. Or if you have limited data and you can't really flesh out that data, just agree to take the risk and just say, okay, we don't really have all the information, but we think it's worth taking this risk and we're going to do that. And if we fail at this decision, we're going to loop back around again and realize that next time we need to make sure that these data points are covered before we actually can get to that decision phase. It's a way also to teach the team to get better about making decisions and what to think about. When people render opinions, we all have opinions, we're human beings. People love to express their opinions. I know I do. Try to reform those opinions into hypotheses. So if somebody says, I think XYZ, restate it as, okay, the hypothesis that you're stating here is that if we do this, then this thing will happen. And when you get out of that realm of opinions and more into, okay, these are possible hypotheses that we can test with the product, you get into a much better space about making a decision about whether to do that thing or not. The focus on responsibilities, not personalities, again, like not the people, but the roles or their responsibilities. It's really trying to focus on the mission and away from personalities. It's hugely helpful. Disagree and commit is the key here. So agreeing to agree and agree to disagree without commitment is meaningless. So one of the things that you have to sort of get really good at in that discussion about making decisions is a commitment that even if you don't agree, that you will try as hard as you can to make that decision come true and really talk about that and raise that as a kind of a practice that you do as a team. So we can discuss for a certain amount of time, we agree on a decision. And if one of those teammates doesn't agree, it's okay, they can disagree, but they must commit. That's part of the deal. That's how you work as a team. And another way to kind of reframe the conversation is to talk about investments rather than features. If you talk about investments, it gets much easier to see that every decision you're making is that difficult balance that I talked about earlier between we do this first and the second, it's going to cost us this much time versus that much time. And if you think about everything as an investment and not just a feature that you're delivering, it becomes much more easy for an objective conversation to take place because everyone can relate to spending a certain amount of money to getting a certain thing. And if you think about that simple like transaction of spending money to get something, that's much easier to discuss rather than like this feature is going to change the world. Like that, it becomes like harder to talk about the objective reality of a feature that you're going to deliver. And if you talk about it in investment terms, it becomes a little bit easier to have a cool head and to think it through in a more rational way. I want to sort of tell a little case study about this as well, just to kind of illustrate how this can work. There was another company that I mentored when I was living in London that had a social network that they were trying to start. And when I joined them as a mentor, they had a very kind of MVP product, and they had just gotten a little bit of funding, and they wanted to rebrand. Their goal was they wanted to sort of like freshen up the whole look and feel, get a bunch more users, and then go for the next round of money. That was their idea. And so I said to the CEO, listen, I think you shouldn't spend a lot of time on this. your goal is to like refresh quickly so you can have a look and feel that's okay, and then go and get some money. And then you can sort of later on really home in on that brand. So what I would do is pick next year's PMS color every year, PMS Alexa color, that's their color of the year. Pick next year's, use that because it's a trendy color. You can't go wrong there. Just do that design quickly, get it out the door, and then start your bigger fundraising. And the problem was that the marketing head completely disagreed. They wanted to stop everything and do a very deep dive on branding at that point. And in my mind, it was just out of the right priority order. It was better to do something quickly at that moment rather than fast. The marketing director didn't agree. We had a mentor from the board who also thought that it wasn't wise to stop everything and rebrand at that moment. And because of that discussion, and because we had a very clear framework for agreeing on the decision, the CEO made the call, nope, we're not going to do a full rebrand right now. We're going to do the quick and dirty thing, and then we're going to come back later and do it properly. They did the quick and dirty thing. They were able to raise money. They ended up moving to Silicon Valley and getting a lot more investment, and they've been very successful. And it was, I'm not saying that it was because of that decision, but it was the fact that they were able to make the decision within an agreed format and framework, that they were able to quickly then carry on to the next thing. And I think that practice and that discipline that they had in their team is what made them successful. Not this particular decision, but just the fact that they were able to have disagreements on the leadership team, commit, do something, move on, and go to the next thing. So basically, the moral of that story is that if you're not exactly sure how to move your team forward with better decision making, which I think is a great idea to do, frameworks can help. There's a framework that we use at Contentful. I've used it before in previous roles as well, and it's a framework I really like. Some of you probably use it and may be familiar. It's called the RAPID framework. It was developed by Bain & Company, which is a big consulting company. But basically, it doesn't matter what framework you use, really. It's not about the framework. It's really about the structure and the agreement to the framework that matters. So in this particular framework, there's a recommender, a decider, and somebody who agrees, someone who can give input, and somebody who ultimately performs the work. But the key there is that there's a role of decider, and that decider really owns that decision, and they make the decision. Someone else can recommend the decision to take, and there can be kind of a keep you honest agreeer in that conversation. But again, it's the roles and not really the it's not really who does what. It's agreeing that those are the roles, and if the decider makes a decision, that we commit to doing that thing. So I highly recommend the RAPID framework. It has a catchy title, and it's also really clear about the roles. There's a ton on the web about it, and I won't go into further details, but that's one framework to use. There are many others. That's really all I wanted to share with you today. Thank you guys very much. I really apologize for the doorbell ringing in the middle of this talk. And I guess we're going to have Q&A now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Benjamin, for the presentation. And yeah, we really enjoyed the entire decision-making process that you shared with us. So everyone who has joined are welcome to now ask question either verbally or through chat in Zoom. And those who have joined us on YouTube or Facebook, you can also type in your questions and we'll transfer them here. Okay, and as we wait for the questions, I have some questions. So you mentioned about this thing that we should loop back into these decisions. So how do you decide that now we should try to rethink and revisit all these decisions? Do we wait always for the results, or yeah, when is the best time, you would say?
Yeah, so that's actually a really great question. You don't, there is no when, you just create a cadence. So it doesn't matter when. So what I do with my teams is we have a monthly business review. And in the monthly business review, we review the decisions. We just say where they are. And if there's not enough data to know, then we just kind of go to the next time. And then a month later, we'll see that decision come back again. And the way that those are tracked are really, we use OKRs as a way of tracking the decisions that we make over time. So we set up an objective, and then the key results flow from that. And that tracks back to the decisions that we made on what to do and what not to do. And that's kind of how we check in on it. And you just, I think the key there is just to have a rolling cadence where you're always looking back. And that habit of looking back and then looking forward is really helpful. And that way you don't need to know. You're doing it every month or every 2 months or whatever that cadence is. Kind of decides for you.
Okay, great. Yeah, that was very helpful. So we have one question from Sumit. I don't know if you would want to verbally ask the question. If not, then I can also share.
Yeah, come on, Sumit, just give us the question.
Yeah, I'll just ask it. So,
all right, we're in text we have, can you provide more examples of headstrong, opinionated CEOs? I have a feeling that there's maybe you have one. I don't know. I'm just guessing. So CEOs are hired because they're very opinionated, but they're also hired because they have a lot of experience, right? And I mean, ideally, that would be the right combination. They have a lot of opinions, but they have a lot of experience to back it up. And I mean, I've dealt with lots of different CEOs, and I guess the key thing that I've learned is whenever you want to have a conversation about a decision that you're making, bring a lot of data to the party. The one way to really smooth out any conversation with a senior leader is to bring a lot of data and evidence to that discussion. And if you don't have any, bring a plan for how you're going to get it. And if that also fails, then you're not really ready to have that decision-making discussion yet. And I would try to push it out and get to a place where you're able to bring some information. It's really, I mean, it's not a very satisfying answer, I know, but really the only way to guide a decision with a senior leader is by having proof. And the best way to do that is research and doing the best you can to build a business case if that's what's in contention. And when you bring that data and you bring a business case forward, then you really have something to discuss where a decision can be made in the light rather than just opinions. So if you have a very headstrong, opinionated CEO and you bring a business case that's backed up with data, that's a very different conversation and a much more productive one, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope this answered the question. I have a follow-up question to this. So suppose that some of the decisions don't work out and the results are not satisfying. So how do you communicate that thing with these kinds of stakeholders?
You mean how do you deliver bad news?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, when you're building a product, the one thing you got to get used to is bad news. It's impossible to make every single decision the right way. The best way to do it is state the hypothesis, state the evidence that you had to lead you to that hypothesis where you thought it was likely and plausible, and then explain exactly what went wrong. Like, understand exactly what went wrong before you go and talk about it. What's super unsatisfying is to go to a senior leader and say, hey, this didn't work out. I don't know. That doesn't, like, that's a bad conversation. A good conversation is, this didn't work out, but we think we know why, or here's some areas at least of inquiry where we think we're going to get to the bottom of this. Really what senior leaders are always looking for is progress and like careful thought about what you're gonna do next. And I guess it's that same thing of like, bring some evidence, bring some discussion to the table that really enriches the situation, and that can really help quite a bit, I think, even if it's bad news.
Yeah,
I don't care personally, like on my team, I don't care if we fail and I don't care if we make wrong decisions. What I care about is that we don't learn from it. If we don't learn from it and we don't understand why, then that's our failure. That's real failure. If we can learn from it and it gives us a better direction for the future, then it's an investment.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really helpful. And I have some questions from YouTube. So Ogden has asked that, can you walk us through a real life example of the rapid framework?
Yeah. Let's see. Let me come up with one that isn't going to reveal any like trade secrets or anything like that. So this isn't a trade secret. We recently did a pricing and packaging change at Contentful where we added some new applications that we launched in March, and we wanted to fix the price. So I have a pricing and packaging specialist on my team, and I have a research head on my team. And the three of us got together and we devised a plan for doing some research, testing out some price points, building a business model. And then we took that business model with the different price points tested to our CEO. The CEO was the decider in that case. The pricing and packaging person was the recommender because he had gone through the business model and picked the price point that he thought was the best. The researcher was input on that decision, and the perform there was the team that actually deals with the pricing page and the commercial flow. So that's an example of the rapid. So the recommender being researcher, agree being me actually in that case, because I just had to say, yes, I agree with this decision. The decider being the CEO, et cetera, et cetera. Like we can go through all the letters, but that's a real example of how it worked. At the end of the day, the CEO picked the price point and agreed with the business model, had a bunch of questions, picked a price point, and that was it. And that's the one we went with.
Yeah,
really all the work. I mean, the key thing here is that the work isn't making the decision. The work is getting it all ready so that a decision can be made in the most rational light as possible. So the people who are recommending and agreeing are actually doing a lot of work ahead of time. So by the time you get to that decision phase, it's much more obvious than it would have been otherwise.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. I hope this answered the question. We have another question from Lucas on YouTube. So any advice if client is afraid of making decisions and organizes a lot of meetings that create more and more questions instead of answers?
Yeah, I mean, we've all been in that meeting, right? I mean, that's a classic, like sort of agree to agree meeting where everybody kind of defers the decision making by asking more questions and adding more data to and keeps asking for additional data and additional data. The best way to sort of combat that is to, first of all, agree a rapid up front, agree a timeline, and as you're sort of going to meetings, you just start the meeting by saying where you are in the process, restating the deadline, restating the questions that were asked in the previous meeting, the answers that you found, and then you ask if you can come to a decision. And then more questions arise and you do it again. And by the second, third meeting, it becomes really obvious that this is, at some point, like this isn't helpful anymore. And eventually the group will sort of come to agree. The next time around on a new decision, on a different decision, it'll go faster if it's the same people, because it won't be, that kind of behavior won't be as tolerated. It becomes like obvious that it's not helpful. So it's, again, it's this idea that it's a journey and not a quick fix. You have to teach teams how to make decisions. The best way to do it is to look backward, say what you've done, reflect on that, and then reflect on what questions we need to answer to get to the decision point, and just keep raising that again and again. And over time, the team will just get better at it. It's oftentimes what you described there happens early in teams or groups where people don't necessarily trust each other. So they're trying to poke at the edges to make sure that the discussion is really real. And that's a legitimate kind of fear that people have. And unfortunately, the only way to really work through that is to just work through it. And the next time around, hopefully it's less painful. And the time after that, it's even less painful. And you just kind of get better at it.
Yeah, thank you, Benjamin, for answering this. It was really helpful. So there's one follow-up question to this rapid framework. So the question is, did you guys align who owns each of these, like each of these letters that represent like R, A, C?
Absolutely. So sorry that wasn't clear. So the way you use the framework is you write the word rapid and then you write the name next to it. And you take that rapid to the first meeting and you hold it up and you say, okay, here's the rapid for the meeting. Does everybody agree? And then you get people to sort of say like, okay, I'm going to decide and I'm going to recommend and you might have to like adjust it a little bit, but the first decision that you make as a team is to agree the rapid. And once that rapid is agreed, then that gives you that framework for all of the rest of the discussion. So it's well worth the investment of time in the beginning.
Yeah, okay.
So you literally write the names. You literally take names and write them down.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. I hope this one answered the question. So yeah, if you have any questions, those of you who have joined us on Zoom, you can ask them. I have one question from my side. So, how do you include the user research while you are doing while you are making these decisions? So, if there's any process or framework to include the user research.
Absolutely. I mean, depending on what you're working on, what the decision is about, you might have different kinds of research that you're using. So it's not like you would use it exactly the same way every time. But for example, in that pricing example that I gave, we did price sensitivity meters to try to figure out with users how much it was worth to them to pay for these products and what the implications were. That data was brought to about 2 or 3 preliminary meetings where we discussed how we were going to frame that discussion to the CEO. And then in the meeting with the CEO, it was also brought forward. So we had the raw data, we had the synthesis, we had the analysis, and then we had the recommendation. So it was used in multiple different ways at different times. But again, it's about all of that pre-work that you do. So by the time you're trying to position the conversation to make the decision, you have everything you need. You've done the analysis, you've got the data, and you've done the analysis, and then you're able to more easily make that decision based on the data. So you bring it in kind of to enrich the conversation at every stage in the best way that it can apply. And that may be different in different cases, but yeah, it's just part of it needs to be part of the discussion to get to the decision.
Okay, yeah. Thank you so much for answering this. So we have another question from Lucas, who says that how to convince that experiments aren't something wrong. I suppose it's data.
Say it again.
Yes. So how to convince that experiments that we are doing aren't something wrong?
Well, how badly does the decider want the decision to be right? So, I mean, it's basically about like, you know, if you want to have a better chance at making the right decision, doing experiments is hugely valuable. And I guess it's a simple kind of return on investment kind of conversation. If we spend time doing experiments and we learn things from it that can then direct the product decisions that we make, that can save the company, save the business a lot of time and effort in doing the wrong thing. And it can get you closer to an even better solution, even if you started out with the right thing. It can help you perfect it, in other words. So it's not an easy answer either, but it's a return on investment answer. You have to just sort of say, for this investment in time and money, we think we'll be able to achieve a much better outcome. And then just sort of like go through that process and prove it if you can. It's hard though, like that's a product culture conversation, right? And it's a little deeper than just experiments per se. It's more like this idea of like failure is something to learn from, and that experiments can help you do a better job. As a product person, as a technology lead, they can help you do a better job if you do experiments, just like in any field. And that conversation is related more to culture, and that might be a little bit harder one.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for this explanation. I hope this answered Lucas' question. So I don't see any further questions on YouTube, and if anyone...
I do have one.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Utkarsh. Thank you, Ben. Very informative. Thank you for the presentation. And I had one question. I'm not sure I got you right, but you said something around investment at some point, and I was wondering, like, is this something like you don't have much data, and you say, okay, like you have the hunch saying like this is not good, and you try to bring like money into the talk, saying like this will cost a lot of money doing. Are you sure that you want to do this?
No, it's actually, I didn't mean it in specific that way, but that's a good example of one way to have a conversation. So what I meant by that was, if you stop thinking about features that you want to deliver, and instead you think about all of the time and effort that you make as investments, that mental framework changes how you think about what you do. So you might get really excited about an idea and have a hunch. And that's like a kind of a hunch is something that sort of like makes you excited as a human being, right? Like you get a hunch and you really want to do it. But if you start to think about like, okay, I've got a hunch, what's the investment now that I need to make to get that hunch over the line? And maybe like in that light, it changes how you think about it, because it might not be so great to just invest in a hunch. It might be better to think about investing in research to prove the hunch, and then you invest in building the results of that research. If you just talk about like hunches and making it happen, then you lose that whole thing of like, no, actually there's a cost associated with this. Everything that I do detracts from something else that I could be doing, or if I put it in the wrong order, could end up making the destination further away or harder to get to. So I guess it's more of just a mental framework that if you cast things in the light of investment versus building something, it seems more expensive, and then that raises more questions, and that makes you more disciplined about making the decisions. If you just kind of like have intuition and hunches, it doesn't seem expensive to like do something, right? It's just a hunch. But an investment, that's something else.
Okay. Yeah, makes
Doesn't
sense.
sound like fun, I know, but it is a much more effective in the long run. It's much more effective. It isn't having a party, that is for sure. Like it really is a rational, cold conversation, but really to build great product in the long run, it's a cold conversation.
Yeah. Totally makes sense. Thanks for the answer, Ben.
Sure.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for answering this one. So I don't see further questions now. So yeah, thank you, Benjamin, for the presentation and answering all these questions. So we'll now continue with networking on Zoom, and those who have joined us on YouTube or Facebook, they can join us on Zoom, and we will continue the networking here.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for coming.